All right, our closing act, right? Pretty good. So the topic of this discussion is access to democracy, which we define at Bloomberg as an issue of fundamental equality. And it's an issue that became a factor, I believe, in both their races. So to start this, just wanted to set the context again. These are numbers that I'm sure you don't want to have to see again. But in Leader Abrams' race, let's see what the vote totals were, please.
The ones that were counted, or? Just say it.
Okay, and you can also see them here. So margin was 54,723. So in Florida, I'm sure this is even more painful for you, Mayor. Let's look at the numbers in the Florida 2018 governor's race. Okay.
Drum roll.
We have them.
Oh, there they go.
32,463. So extremely close. Now, I wanted to show some of the issues that voters faced in each state, or would-be voters. So you can see here in Georgia, more than 1.5 million registered voters were kicked off the rolls between 2012 and 2018, which was just in the 2 years before the election, 10.6% of voters. 214 precincts closed, 8% of the state's polling places. 53,000 in the weeks before the election, 53,000 registration applications. The large majority of which were from black voters were put on hold because of an exact match requirement, which is something that we want to talk about. And then at the time, I should also point out, the opponent was Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, who was in charge of the election that he was running in. And he was caught on some leaked audio expressing concern about the impressive voter turnout campaign that Stacey Abrams had. And he said he was concerned about it, especially if everybody uses and exercises their right to vote. So in Florida, again, large purge of voters. At one point, Florida officials were prohibited from putting up early voting at public institutions, public schools, until a federal judge intervened. As we know, and this is something that I want to talk about with Mayor Gillum, is that we know that Floridians voted to restore the voting rights of 1.4 million convicted felons. The legislature now is working to strip that away.
Right.
So that's the context.
It's a pretty picture, huh?
Welcome to America.
Yeah, right. At least the South.
So, Mayor Gillum, as you were running this race, as you were preparing to run and then as you were running it, what were some of the other issues that you saw with voters being able to express their opinion?
Yeah. Well, first, hello, everybody. It is good to be here with y'all in New York. I brought a little warmth from Florida. You could experience it outside. But I have to tell you, running for governor of Florida was, without a doubt, the highlight of my life. I spent 2 years putting everything that I had, personally and otherwise, into this race on the belief that we could get out there, move more people to vote, and in so doing, produce an electorate that looked like America, looked like my state. And if that electorate had the ability to fully engage that, I think we would come out on top. And in a normal midterm election in Florida, we turn out about 6.1 million voters were expected in the governor's race. Presidential races, we come close to 9 million voters. In Florida, we had 8.5 million people go out and vote in a gubernatorial election. We blew the roof off of the expectation of voters. And for the very first time in Florida, black voters voted at their share and a little bit higher of their share of the population. Young voters, 18 to 25, doubled their share of the electorate. And unfortunately, in a state like ours and states like Stacey's and others, I was fortunate because the referee was also not a player on the field, which is obviously what happened in the state of Georgia, which those issues were, unfortunate, pervasive, and theft-like. And our race, the reason why it doesn't look so horrible from a disenfranchisement standpoint is because it is the law of the land. So the fact that you got to sue to get polling places on college campuses, the fact that tens of thousands of ballots were invalidated due to signature mismatch, which basically is the W in my signature didn't look like the one from 4 years ago, and therefore that ballot was not counted. It was rejected.
That's the exact match.
That's the exact match.
So the signature
part of it.
match.
Signature match.
Sorry, signature.
Signature match. And by the way, the University of Florida presented a report in 2007 which showed in the state of Florida, ballots rejected over signature mismatch, 7 out of 10 are voters of color. You saw in Parkland, young people 18 to 25, and this just came out a week ago, had a rejection rate of their ballots that was double the state average, right? So these are, again, the only thing I would ask is that in a race like ours, and quite frankly, in any race in this country, that the person who is sworn in is the one who got the most votes. It's a novel idea. But my belief is that, that's how democracy is supposed to work. And so now we're fighting this battle all over again because we got 1.4 million former felons who are now re-enfranchised with the Florida legislature. By the way, we changed the Constitution to make that happen. Florida legislature right now is trying to think of ways that they can undermine that by adding that former felons have to now pay court fees, which are oftentimes double or more what the restitution is. And the Brennan Center presented a report that said when returning citizens have to pay that cost, only 3% of them pay. So if that stat holds true, you're talking about 97% of that 1.4 million not participating in the process, thus nullifying what the voters have just passed.
Some critics of that have called that a new poll tax, right?
Well, it was certain. Yeah,
right.
I would agree.
Right.
I would agree.
So, Leader Abrams, when you went to the polls on Election Day, what happened?
So I did early voting, and I want to join Andrew in saying thank you for having us. Thank you all for listening. When I went to the polls, I wanted to encourage early voting because Georgia has actually some of the most generous early voting procedures in the country. The problem is this year people decided to use, or 2018 people used them and they got mad. I went to early vote. I walked up to the counter. I had CNN, ABC, NBC, everyone was following me. And when I get up there and present my ID and get ready to get my ballot, the young woman leans forward and says, "You've already voted." I'm like, I would have remembered that. This is a pretty important day. I'm fairly certain I did not. And so I lean, I'm like, no, I didn't. She's like, you got an absentee ballot. I said, I've never requested an absentee ballot, and I've been voting since 1992. And she looks at me. She desperately wants to give me my ballot, and she looks at the screen. It says, I can't have one. And so I'm like, I need you to go get your manager. So she leaves, brings someone back, and this woman looks at me, and she looks at the cameras, and she's like, and I'm keeping my voice low, and I said, I need my ballot. And she's like, you've already voted. I said, no, I haven't. Again, I didn't do astral projection. I do not remember being here. I need my ballot. And the thing was, I understand the process. Most people, when they are told that there is a flaw, they assume it's their fault, and they go home. I had agency and a phalanx of cameras, so they figured it out. But the other thing is, a few weeks later, when Brian Kemp went to cast his ballot, he wasn't on the rolls.
Right.
He had a hard time. I can't figure out exactly what it was, but they wouldn't give him his ballot at first, or the card didn't work, but he also had a hard time casting his ballot. The architect of the system that denied everyone the right to vote almost denied him the right to vote.
And that gets to another issue here, which is education of the and adequate poll numbers, adequate workers, adequate numbers of poll workers, and adequate education of them, right?
Absolutely.
Which, and, I'm sorry to say, Mayor, but you know this. Florida has a history with election issues. So I wanted to ask you both about the 2013 decision that the Supreme Court made in which they rolled back some of the protections afforded under the Voting Rights Act. Principally, this issue of preclearance, in which some states, which historically had patterns of discrimination, had to submit proposed changes to voting rights, for example, to the Justice Department before they were enacted. And that was taken away.
That's right.
Do you think that had an effect on what happened in your elections?
Absolutely. Georgia is one of 19 states that, in the aftermath of the striking down of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, implemented even more rules. But we know that nationwide, states rushed to close off access, but also to roll back access. And I know for a fact that that allowed the Secretary of State / my opponent to close 8.5% of the precincts. Now think about it. I lost by 1.4% of the vote, but 8.5% of the precincts weren't available. He was able to purge voters, including purging more than 600,000 voters right before he threw his name into the ring to run for governor. We know that without preclearance, not only is there the issue of the votes not being counted or cast, but it also means that you have to prove there was harm before you can get remedy. What preclearance said is, we won't let you take away a person's citizenship right at all. We're going to make you stop before you start. But by knocking out Section 5, it now says you have to prove that it was harmed and that the harm could be undone. The average voter can't prove that they were part of a massive system of voter suppression. What they know is, I went to vote and I was told no. I don't sign my signature the same way from Kroger to CVS. Right? And if that's used to deny me my fundamental right to vote, Section 5 is the only protection that they have, because all of those rules are designed to not allow any one person to diminish and deny the right to vote to any citizen who's eligible to cast a ballot.
Speaking of how you sign the signature, and parts and precincts, which are in Florida, 67 different counties, the rules can be different depending upon which county that you're in. So when I went to sign, they have, those credit card boxes when you go to a store and you use either your pen or whatever, you use that little box as your signature. Now when I'm using that box at a store, do my initials, ADG. When I sign my registration form, I'm certain I use my complete signature. And the woman did look up at me strange, and I had about the same throng of cameras that you did, and I think she certainly had the good sense not to make a scene there. But that to me doesn't make a bit of sense. And not to mention, there is not a uniform way to inform a voter if their ballot has not been counted. So in Florida, we had the bombings that took place, the person who was sending those bombs all around the country. Well, he used a heavily black post office in South Florida. And so for absentee ballots that were in that post office, that security slowed it down. And in the state of Florida, if your ballot absentee is not received on the day of the election, it is not counted, even though the counting continues for weeks after the election being over. So through no fault of their own, the voter, it's postmarked on time, mailed on time, but because it wasn't received at the supervisor of elections office on time, did not get counted. So not only is signature a problem.
Do you know how many ballots we're talking about in that
case?
I
mean, in total, the number that came out is there were 80,000 ballots that were legally cast and not counted in the state of Florida. That's not to include undervote, overvote conditions in our state.
Georgia had identical problems. The challenge for us is that the Secretary of State did not require the counties to adequately and accurately report the number of ballots that they didn't issue, that they didn't receive, or that they discounted. It is his job to do so, but it just so happens the counties that were the most egregious in their underreporting also had the highest percentage of communities of color, I believe. Right. And so we know that the challenge is, I mean, the lawsuit that we filed, and I think you'll get to this, but there's a system that's in place to disenfranchise voters. It is not a single issue. It is signature match, which runs afoul of those who actually submit their absentee ballot. But that's assuming you can get your absentee ballot. It assumes that the county sent you it. Florida has 67 counties. We've got 159. You cannot have 159 different democracies within the same state. Crossing an arbitrary line should not diminish your authenticity as a citizen in the United States of America.
Totally agree. And I would just say, so not only do you have, there's a signature match issue, and you may have experienced this as well, but in precincts where you have routinely higher turnouts of voters black voters, particularly on a specific day, are waiting in line, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, and even more, where in other precincts where they get 2 or 3 times the number of voters, you go right in and you come right out.
Right.
What is the sense that goes into that? And so,
And what's the remedy for that?
well, to properly staff, to properly anticipate that every year that you have a souls to the polls on a Sunday, that you're going to have a large showing, and therefore you properly accommodate locations so you can move people very seamlessly through. That has a deterrent effect.
But is it a deliberate, I mean, obviously it's a deliberate act to close polling stations. You have to make a decision on what to do. But were they closed to affect the vote, do you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's the reality. Georgia, like Florida, had an unprecedented turnout. In 2014, 1.1 million Democrats voted. 2018, 1.2 million black people voted for me.
Right.
The turnout rate on the Democratic side was 1.9 million voters.
You had more voters than any other Democrat in Georgia history.
Correct. But we know that voter suppression is a system. So it begins with, well, thank you. But we have to think about it longitudinally. It begins with voter registration access. Getting on the rolls. Florida's faced issues with third-party registration. I was subpoenaed by the Secretary of State 4 years ago for actively registering people to vote. Then it becomes purging. If you can get them on, he pulled them off. Then you had the exact match system, which said that your application had to exactly match either a Social Security database or a DMV database that have different rules. And so not only were 53,000 people held hostage, 90% were people of color, 70% were African American, and he was told by a federal judge the year before that it was racially discriminatory and not to do it again, so he got the state legislature to pass a state version of the law to give him the imprimatur to do it. So registration access is first. The second is poll closures, and that's ballot access. So it's closing polling places in places where people who are not likely to vote for you are going to show up. In the South, race is the strongest predictor of political leanings. I think it's roughly 50% of the poll closures, no, I'm sorry, I don't get the stat wrong, but I will say this. If you look at the pattern of closures, it disproportionately affected black communities and communities of color. Then you have the issue of absentee ballots applied for but never sent. And you have the issue of the ballots being received but not counted through the signature match. And then in Georgia, we had the under-resourcing of these places. He said 30 minutes, 45 minutes. We had 4-hour wait times in Georgia. Georgia had the highest wait times for African Americans in the country. You know there are black people who live there. We've been there for a minute. And the challenge with that wait time is that it operates as a poll tax. In the state of Georgia, you have the right to vote. You do not have the right to receive pay for voting. So when you are standing in a 4-hour line, having taken an hour to get there through Atlanta traffic, you've now forfeited half of your salary for the day on the off chance that you make it all the way inside. And what is so terrifying is that every person who faced that was told that it was their fault, that they somehow were complicit in their own inability to cast a ballot. And the reality is for most of these folks, if they tried to do absentee ballots, they would have had a signature match problem. For a lot of them, they had to fight to be returned to the rolls because they were unlawfully purged. So the question is, was it on purpose? Absolutely. It is an architecture that is designed to say that the people whose voices are most needed in our body politic will not be heard, and we will do everything in our power to make that so.
Did you want to, Did you want to add to that?
So the only thing I would add, so in Florida in 2008, after Obama's election, and again, he pulled out a squeaker win in Florida, getting 1% of the vote. We're traditionally a 1% state, which is a difference. The Florida legislature then adopted registration rules, basically criminalizing the registration process. So if you wanted to be a group, many of the civic groups, church groups, otherwise, who went out and registered voters, you had to first get registered with the state. You were assigned a number. Every one of your registration forms needed to have that number on it. And I think that the timeline was if you didn't turn that registration in within 72 hours, you could be criminally prosecuted. So groups like the League of Women Voters wholesale pulled out of registration in the state of Florida. And in 2008, Democrats had a registration advantage in my state of over 700,000 more registered Democrats than Republicans. When I was on the ballot this last November, that number had a precipitous decline to an advantage of 250,000, just below that number. So it has had the desire to have protections around the registration process, which was never a real problem in our state, had one intent and one intent alone, and that was to chill groups that were out there actively registering huge amounts of people to vote, to stop them from doing so. And it had the exact intended effect. And therefore, the margins between the winner and the loser in these races have continued to become, extremely close. And people, quite frankly, we got in my state now 4 million people who are eligible to be registered to vote who are unregistered.
Wow. You're doing something about that, which I want to get to. Let's first talk about your response to what you went through with Fair Fight. So you didn't concede.
No.
You acknowledged.
Yes. I created a new standard.
And what did you find in that period before you did acknowledge?
With all due respect to my Jewish friends, I describe that 10-day period as sitting Shiva. So between election night and the day of my non-concession speech, we received more than 50,000 calls from people who faced voter disenfranchisement. We filed 4 federal lawsuits, us and a consortium of voting groups, 3.5 results in our favor. The 4th one, they simply said the law didn't allow for the remedy that was needed, which meant they knew there were problems. And I spent some of that time just sort of mulling over, how do you stop this from happening? There is no way I will ever win the 2018 election on paper. But I needed to understand, how do I make certain that in 2020, those voters who showed up show up again? In 2014, I launched the New Georgia Project, which has registered 350,000 of the 800,000 unregistered people of color in Georgia. The next part is Fair Fight, which is making certain that the electoral process works. We filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit, the first of its kind, that argues that essentially the system of disenfranchisement mimics the de facto segregation that occurred under Brown v. Board of Education, and that we cannot have a whack-a-mole process where we fix one piece and another piece breaks. We have to say the entire system is unlawful and has to be overturned. We are working, so that's litigation. We are working with Congress on legislation. We are working with Congresswoman Fudge and Congresswoman Sewell to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And we're doing advocacy that says that people need to remember that their votes are connected to their values. And if you do not vote, you do not have access, your voice isn't heard. And then we, as of Monday, launched a 3rd group called Fair Count, which means that every person in the state of Georgia, especially people of color, immigrants, children, and renters, and low-income communities will be counted in the 2020 census, because if they do not get counted, they will not count.
Right.
Right. That's right.
What's the status of the lawsuit?
So the lawsuit, we are currently in a bit of fisticuffs with the state. They are pushing a motion to dismiss, arguing that the Secretary of State is not actually in charge of the elections. Could have fooled me. But they're essentially arguing that the state elections official should not be held accountable for the problems at the local level. But to your point earlier, training is one of the responsibilities of the Secretary of State. You cannot be the election supervisor. That's like the CEO saying, I'm not responsible for anyone who works for me because I don't do every job. Your job is to make sure everyone does their job. And I ran against a cartoon villain who was the referee, the contestant, the scorekeeper, but he was also incompetent and malfeasant. And so that combination allows him to sometimes argue that he wasn't responsible simply because he didn't mess up everything. Well, you messed up enough, and the other parts you intentionally destroyed, and you should not be rewarded for that. And so the litigation argues that that needs to be fixed if we have democracy in America.
Mayor, a couple of weeks ago, you launched a new project of your own called Forward Florida. What's the goal of that?
Yeah, so on the litigation side, we were fortunate because we got a decision, at least from the federal courts, pointing out that the laws in the state of Florida are inconsistent and have compelled the legislature to reform Florida law so that it is a more reflective democratic process, to include some consistency as well as early warning around signature mismatch and ballots that are rejected for signature mismatch. That's only a slight win.
Do you have confidence that this legislature can do that?
I don't have confidence in this legislature at all. So I think there will be follow-up action that is required. There's no doubt about it. This is the same legislature that's right now trying to single-handedly undo an amendment that was passed by over 63% of the voters in the state of Florida, which was to return
Actually,
rights to former felons.
I wanted to ask you one question about that. Did that require passing that amendment require the legislature to do anything?
It did not. The amendment on Amendment 4 is very simple. Florida voters said that we are a forgiving state. We believe that people should have a second chance and that not one of us should be judged forever by our worst day. That was a value, and the overwhelming majority of people who went out and voted agree with that value. We believe it is self-executing. If you have paid your debt to society after committing your crime, and you fit into the covered crimes that would have their rights to vote restored, you ought to have your right to vote. You ought to be able to get out there and exercise that right to vote. It's a novel, again, concept, and it's one that the legislature is trying to undermine right now in this process. What we announced last week, and through one organization, I got to get up to 2 more, I guess, Stacey, is that we're going to register between now and Election Day 2020 a million new voters in the state of Florida. We've got over 4 million that are available to us, and so we want to try to go out and get a quarter of them in a very targeted way to get registered, but the registration is only the beginning. What we then have to do is make sure that we get in communication and in regular community with these voters so that this isn't the last time they hear from us. We all know that everyone registered doesn't necessarily vote. But the truth is that if you can put a little bit more marbles on the table, if a few fall off, it doesn't cost you the entire election. This is going to be hard work. It's going to take significant resources. But I honestly believe that if we, in a state like Florida, where every election seems to come down to 1% difference, in my case, now we're down to 0.4% difference between the winner and the loser, every single vote matters. And if we can change the electorate in Florida, if we can create the kind of electorate that we deserve and not just the one that we have, I have a guarantee that Florida will flip blue in 2020 and the nation will thank us for the eviction notice being delivered to Donald Trump.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions about what their future plans might be. Wonder what that might be. But I have a poll, and I'm about to ask you. So I want you to get out your phones because we have a poll question coming up that's a very important one. I think you'll want to answer it. So make sure you get to the app. Mayor, besides the voter registration and effort, what future political plans might you have?
Yeah. I'm just here to learn Stacey's future political plans. Honestly, between now and 2020, my job is to make Florida ready so that it will go blue in 2020. We don't have a race in my state in 2020, any statewide or national races, other than the presidential. And so that's why I'm going to put my time, energy, and effort, unless somebody I know who inspires me on a regular basis decides to do something else. I'm hanging tight.
So I'm going to ask Leader Abrams this question, which she's been asked actually multiple times today alone. But first, I want your help because I think maybe you can can help. So let's go to our last poll of the day, please. Stacey Abrams should run for.
Oh, you got to fill in the blank.
Let's see. It's I guess yes, Governor of Georgia, U.S. Senate, or President of the United States. Oh, okay. Well, all right.
Oh,
Stop making noise.
I'm Stacey Abrams soundtrack.
Okay. Well, we have a narrow winner. Okay. So Stacey Abrams.
Yes.
What's your plan? Feel free
Well,
to
apparently
reveal
the
it.
polls have spoken.
Does that mean you're declaring here
All right.
at this stage?
I declare nothing. This is how I get myself in trouble. Look, I am, number one, I'm so honored and gratified that the work that we've done, the work that I will continue to do, resonates. But you shouldn't run for an office just because an office is there. You shouldn't run for an office as a stepping stone to another office. And you should run when you are called to be the person to make that change. That's how I've always approached politics. I am not by nature a political person. I'm pretty good at it, but that's not, it's work for me. But it's work I am privileged and blessed to do. And so my obligation is to be as thoughtful in deciding what I do as I intend to be when I choose to do the job. And so it's going to take a little time because I expected to be governor or to be on a beach. I had two options. I did not expect whatever this was that we called my election. In the aftermath, I've been just extraordinarily lucky to have opportunities. My responsibility is to make a choice that is grounded in my values and the ethic of doing the right thing and making a choice that I can win. And it's not about the poll numbers. It's that I will win it because I'm going to work harder than anyone ever has to make certain that every voice in the state of Georgia is actually heard. And I think when that happens, no matter what I'm running for, we are going to be victorious.
But just to get a little insight into your
Come
thinking
on,
process.
That's a really thoughtful answer. Okay,
That wasn't
yes.
really, that was a good one.
Thank you.
I wanted to dissect it just a little bit.
Please.
So in your own mind, how do you weigh these choices?
I mean, I sincerely want to understand how I would do the job. I was in the state legislature for 11 years. I was the leader for 7 years. I understand the legislative process. I understand the capacity for platform, but I also understand the restrictions of having to navigate every decision past 50 colleagues, if you've got them on your side, plus 100 people writ large. And that's a different kind of job.
Right.
I enjoy the work of the executive, especially in the South, where strong executives can change lives. Andrew can tell you that Stand Your Ground didn't come into existence until Jeb Bush made it so. That Tommy Thompson was responsible for the erosion of the welfare reform and the erosion of the Social Security, the safety net. Jim Crow never had a federal law. It was all state. Governors are important, and they're often discounted and devalued because they are not seen as the architects of social policy that they are. And then the presidency, by God, we need a new one. And so for me, I'm thinking about what the job requires. I'm thinking about, do I want to do that job for the length of time it requires? 6 years is the commitment if you go to the Senate. 4 years if I run for governor. 4 years if I run for president. Do I have the capacity? I think I'm smart enough to do all of these jobs. But the question is, am I the right person? Because the minute I step forward or if I win, I'm telling someone else they shouldn't be that person. And that's a requirement to me as well, because I know a lot of the good people in Georgia who are thinking about running. I need to make sure that I'm the person who should have this opportunity and that I'm the best person to take that role.
Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank you both. I think this is their actual first joint appearance.
Yes.
Well, since the election.
Since the election.
We
All right,
appeared
I'll
at
take it.
dinner
We appear on Facebook Live.
and on Facebook Live.
None of that counts. This is the one that counts.
Mark, you are our first moderated appearance. Yeah.
I'll take it. So please join me in thanking them for coming. And thank you very much. We have one more part. Please stick around for one more aspect of the conference.
We're not going to do a poll on Andrew?
No.
Thank you.
I've already announced. Hang it out.